Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks.
For
Dismissed!
11 seasons, one television show managed to do something almost no other comedy has ever pulled off. Make an entire nation laugh and cry in the same 22 minutes. MASH wasn't just a hit. It was a phenomenon that outlived the war it was named after by more than 7 times over, and it left behind a series finale that, decades later, still holds the record for the most-watched scripted television broadcast in American history. But the story happening behind the camera was almost as dramatic as anything that aired on it. Across its run, MASH lost several of its most beloved original cast members, and none of them left for the same reason. Some walked away chasing bigger dreams. Some left because the job was quietly destroying them. Some left because their characters had simply run out of road. And at least one departure was so sudden that the writers had to invent a death on the spot, just to explain it to the audience. This is the real story of why the actors who built MASH into a legend eventually chose to leave it behind. Before we get into the exits, it's worth understanding just how unlikely MASH's success actually was. The show was adapted from Richard Hooker's 1968 novel, itself based loosely on Hooker's own experience as a battlefield surgeon in Korea. Robert Altman turned that novel into a 1970 film that was strange, cynical, and utterly unlike anything Hollywood was making at the time, and audiences, reeling from the ongoing war in Vietnam, embraced its dark humor completely. CBS bet that the same tone could work on a weekly television schedule, which was a genuine gamble. Sitcoms in 1972 were not supposed to deal with amputations, death, or the psychological toll of combat. Creators Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds pushed CBS to let the show breathe as a genuine drama with jokes in it rather than a joke delivery machine with a war backdrop. The first season nearly got canceled for low ratings. A slot change to Saturday nights, right after a run of other CBS hits, turned everything around, and by its second and third seasons, MASH had become appointment viewing. As it grew more confident, the show also grew more ambitious. It began experimenting with unconventional episode structures, dropped the laugh track during operating room scenes, and increasingly let its characters carry real emotional weight instead of just delivering punchlines. Alda, who played Chief Surgeon Hawkeye Pierce, became more and more involved creatively, eventually writing and directing dozens of episodes himself. That creative shift is the quiet thread running through almost every major cast departure that followed. As Hawkeye became the emotional center of the show, several other actors found their own characters shrinking to make room. No MASH departure is more famous than McLean Stevenson's, and that's largely because of how it was handled rather than why it happened. Stevenson played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the genial, slightly bumbling commanding officer of the 4077th. Henry wasn't sharp like Hawkeye or cunning like Trapper John. He was the guy who seemed constantly one step behind the chaos around him. Fishing enthusiast, distracted husband, a man who wanted nothing more than to survive the war and go home to his family in Bloomington, Illinois. Audiences adored him precisely because he wasn't a hero. He was believable, and Stevenson's warmth made Henry feel like the show's moral center of gravity even when he wasn't its funniest character. By his own account in later interviews, Stevenson began to feel that his role was shrinking as the show's focus tightened around Hawkeye. He had come into MASH with ambitions of being a leading man, and he watched the show's creative gravity pull steadily toward Alda instead. Rather than staying in what he saw as a supporting role indefinitely, Stevenson chose to leave at the end of Season 3 to pursue his own starring vehicle. What happened next is the part everyone remembers. Instead of writing Henry off with the usual sitcom send-off, a transfer, a promotion, a quiet retirement, Gelbart and Reynolds decided to use his exit to make a statement about the show's entire premise. In the final moments of the Season 3 finale, Abyssinia, Henry. After an episode spent celebrating Henry's long-awaited discharge, Radar walks into the operating room and announces that Henry's plane went down over the Sea of Japan with no survivors. There's no score, no laugh track, just stunned silence and the sound of surgical instruments. It remains one of the boldest moments in sitcom history, precisely because almost none of the cast had been told it was coming. Alda has said only Gary Berghoff, who delivered the line, knew in advance, meaning the shock on the other actors' faces was largely genuine. The backlash was immediate. CBS reportedly received a flood of angry mail from viewers who felt blindsided and betrayed by the choice to kill a character so beloved. But the producer stood by the decision, arguing that a show set in a war zone owed its audience the reminder that not everyone gets to go home. For Stevenson personally, the move away from MASH didn't pay off the way he'd hoped. He starred in 2 of his own sitcoms in quick succession, and both were canceled within a season. In interviews years later, he reflected candidly that leaving MASH had been a mistake, admitting that he'd walked away from something rare without fully appreciating what he had. He continued working steadily in television until his death in 1996, but he never again found a role that resonated the way Henry Blake had. Ironically, the character he left behind became more famous in his final scene than in any other moment of the show's run. If McLean Stevenson's exit was loud and unforgettable, Wayne Rogers's was almost the opposite. Abrupt, undramatic on screen, and handled with none of the ceremony given to Henry Blake. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's original partner in crime, and one half of the wisecracking duo that defined the show's early identity. The 2 of them were meant to be co-leads, trading banter and getting each other out of trouble in equal measure. But as the series matured and Alda's creative involvement deepened, Rogers began to feel that Trapper's role had been reduced to something closer to a sidekick. He later described the shift bluntly, saying his character had gone from being an equal partner to little more than someone who agreed with whatever Hawkeye said. Unlike Stevenson, Rogers didn't negotiate a farewell arc. He simply declined to renew his involvement after season 3, and reportedly the production didn't have full confirmation that he was gone until shortly before season 4 began filming. Adding to the strangeness of the situation, Rogers had apparently never signed a formal contract for the show. He'd been working under a handshake agreement the entire time, which meant the studio had no real legal leverage to compel him to stay or to hold him to any notice period. The result was a genuinely awkward transition. There was no farewell episode, no goodbye scene, nothing beyond a brief line early in season 4 explaining that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye happened to be on leave. Mike Farrell was brought in almost immediately as B.J. Honeycutt, a character deliberately written as steadier and more settled than Trapper had been, which ended up nudging the whole show toward the more reflective, emotionally layered tone it became known for in its middle and later seasons. Rogers, notably, seemed to carry little resentment from the experience. He moved on from acting into a second, highly successful career as an investor and financial commentator, eventually becoming a recognizable voice on financial television. He and Alda remained on good terms for decades afterward. Alda has spoken warmly of Rogers' intelligence, and when Rogers passed away in 2015, Alda's public tribute described him as smart, funny, and dedicated. Whatever tension existed on set clearly didn't survive as personal animosity. Of all the original cast departures, Gary Berghoff's is the one most rooted in personal well-being rather than professional ambition or creative frustration. Berghoff played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, the preternaturally perceptive company clerk who could hear incoming helicopters before anyone else, and who carried a teddy bear as a quiet symbol of the innocence the war was slowly stripping away from him. He was the only actor to reprise his role from the original 1970 film, and over the course of the series, he transformed Radar from a slightly mischievous background character into arguably the emotional conscience of the entire unit. But playing that role for 7 seasons took a real toll. Berghoff has spoken about struggling with anxiety during the show's run, compounded by the grueling production schedule that came with the series, filming dozens of episodes a year. He also became a father during this period, and the demands of the shoot meant long stretches away from his family, something he later described with genuine regret, saying he felt he'd missed pieces of his daughter's early childhood that he couldn't get back. Berghoff also pushed for changes to his contract, asking for reduced screen time and more scheduling flexibility so he could spend more time at home. The production made some accommodations, but by season 8 he had decided he was done, both emotionally and professionally. Co-star Mike Farrell later reflected that Berghoff often felt he wasn't getting the recognition he deserved, while acknowledging that the rest of the cast respected him far more than he seemed to realize at the time. Radar's exit, unlike Trapper's, was given real weight. The 2-part episode Goodbye, Radar is still considered one of the show's most affecting storylines. Radar returns from leave to find the unit falling apart without him, tries instinctively to fix everything the way he always has, and ultimately realizes it's time to go home to help run his family's farm. The final image, Radar walking away under the Korean sky, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, plays out almost entirely without dialogue, and it remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's history. After MASH, Berghoff largely stepped back from the spotlight. A short-lived spin-off called Walt *R didn't catch on, and rather than continue chasing acting work, he shifted his focus toward painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing. He holds several patents, including one related to fishing tackle. He said simply that he left for two reasons: his family and burnout, and that he needed to reclaim pieces of his own life. Today he lives largely out of public view, occasionally surfacing at conventions or in the rare interview, still remembered as the soul of the 4077th. Not every MASH departure was tangled up in personal hardship or professional resentment. Larry Linville's exit stands out as one of the more deliberate, almost graceful ones. Linville played Major Frank Burns, the sanctimonious, rule-obsessed rival to Hawkeye and Trapper, a man whose insecurity and hypocrisy made him the show's easiest character to root against. Frank worked brilliantly in the show's earlier, broader comedic seasons, functioning as a kind of cartoonish foil whose pettiness gave the lead something to bounce off of. But as MASH shifted toward more nuanced, morally complicated storytelling, Frank's one-dimensional nature became harder to sustain. His flaws never evolved, and Linville, an actor with more range than the role allowed him to show, reportedly felt he'd taken the character as far as it could go. By the end of Season 5, Linville chose not to renew his contract. He wasn't pushed out, and there was no behind-the-scenes rupture driving the decision. By his own account, he simply felt Frank Burns had nothing left to say. The show wrote him off-screen entirely, with Frank receiving a conveniently timed transfer rather than any dramatic farewell, a fairly muted send-off for a character who had been so central to the show's early comedic engine. The creative consequences of his departure turned out to be significant. With Frank gone, the writers no longer needed a stock villain to generate conflict, which opened the door for a more sophisticated antagonist in David Ogden Stiers' Major Charles Emerson Winchester III, a proud, cultured Bostonian whose conflicts with Hawkeye and BJ were rooted in genuine philosophical disagreement rather than simple pettiness. Many longtime fans still prefer the scrappier, Frank Burns-era seasons, but there's a strong case that Linville's exit pushed MASH toward the more layered storytelling it became famous for in its second half. Linville continued working steadily in television afterward, though he never landed another role with quite the same cultural footprint as Frank Burns. Amid all these departures, one member of the original cast simply never left. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan for all 11 seasons, one of only a handful of actors to appear in both the pilot and the series finale. Margaret began the show saddled with a fairly one-note role, a rigid, by-the-book head nurse largely defined by her nickname, and a running gag from the original film. But over more than a decade, Swit fought to give the character depth, gradually transforming her into a genuinely respected officer capable of both toughness and vulnerability, someone who questioned the war's cruelty without ever compromising her professionalism. Swit has said in interviews that her goal from the beginning was to make Margaret a woman of substance, and by the time the series ended, that's exactly what audiences saw. Her staying power gave the show a stable emotional through-line even as so many of the actors around her came and went. Looking at these departures together, a clear pattern starts to emerge. MASH didn't lose its stars because the show was falling apart, quite the opposite. It lost them because the show kept growing more ambitious, and as its creative focus increasingly centered on Hawkeye Pierce, several other characters were left with less room to develop. For some actors, like McLean Stevenson and Wayne Rogers, that shrinking spotlight was reason enough to leave in search of bigger opportunities elsewhere. For Gary Berghoff, the reasons ran deeper and more personal, tied to burnout and the cost of years spent away from his family. And for Larry Linville, the decision was almost the opposite of a grievance, a recognition that his character had simply told the story it was meant to tell. What's remarkable is that MASH not only survived each of these departures, but often used them to push itself creatively. The death of Henry Blake reminded audiences that the show was fundamentally about the cost of war. The quiet exit of Trapper John made room for a more grounded, emotionally complex series. Radar's tearful goodbye captured loss in a way few sitcoms had ever attempted, and Frank Burns's low-key departure cleared space for one of television's most memorable slow-burn rivalries. MASH is remembered today not just for its jokes, but for its willingness to treat character turnover as part of the story itself, to let people leave the way people actually leave a war zone, some suddenly, some quietly, some with regret, and some at exactly the right moment. 11 seasons and more than a decade after it began, the show closed out with the most-watched television episode in American history, a finale that owed its emotional power in no small part to everything the series had already lost and grown from losing along the way.